Paddy Cosgrave said, go to Collusion or don't go.
No, don't go.
Meet people. Don't go. Okay,
No,
just
don't
firmly.
go.
Just
if
firmly
you're
don't go.
Canadian, just go like, fuck
go.
off.
Okay.
I'm not going to that thing. God damn it, those people and stuff. Like, can't wait till they're out of our city because insert some reason.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the BetaKit Podcast. I am Douglas Saltis, editor-in-chief of BetaKit, and today we speak with Paddy Cosgrave, founder and CEO of Web Summit. Why? Well, Collusion, one of Web Summit's portfolio of tech conferences, takes place next week, and it expects to bring in 40,000 people from around the world to Toronto, generating what is projected to be $77 million in economic impact. It's a pretty big deal. Collusion also announced this week that it is coming back to Toronto next year, and that is also a pretty big deal. BetaKit was first to report the likelihood of that in May as part of a broader piece noting how the departure of our mayor had put renewal plans in question, plans that at one time had been focused on a 3-year deal valued at more than $40 million in financial and in-kind support from all 3 levels of government. Now, those stories kicked off so many conversations across Canada about the economic value of global tech events, about the role of governments in attracting them, whether supporting international events undermined homegrown counterparts, and whether another Canadian city might swoop in and score Collusion from Toronto while we don't have a mayor or a functioning budget. That's such an interesting conversation that we recorded a whole separate podcast for it. But that podcast didn't have Paddy and his takes, or frankly, an opportunity for us to ask him why he disparaged BetaKit's reporting on the record before doing an about face and publicly inviting us to speak on stage at Collusion. Now, it doesn't seem likely that any conversation on stage at Collusion is going to happen, but we do have this conversation here on the podcast. Unfortunately, there were a lot of topics we were interested in speaking to that Paddy wasn't. He wasn't too interested in speaking to the value proposition of an event like Collusion, or the likelihood of it returning to Toronto past 2024, or why some people across Canada might have soured on the conference in the last few months. What was he interested in talking about? Well, he was keen to note the other Canadian cities, either rumored or confirmed, to be pitching for Collusion after next year, along with a re-energized courtship from the US. And he very much wanted to talk about his support of journalism, serious investigative journalism, and how BetaKit's reporting had, in his eyes, fallen short. Which was intriguing given that while Paddy wasn't all that interested in hearing about the additional documents BetaKit has obtained, indicating that Destination Toronto was in fact working on a $42.6 million pitch for another 3-year deal. He kept actually cutting me off during the interview. He was adamant that no one at Web Summit had ever seen or heard of their existence. Paddy also took the opportunity to resurface and extend some of the criticisms of fellow Canadian publication The Logic and its founder David Skok over a spat regarding media accreditation, press freedom, and maybe event competition. So much so that we felt an obligation to allow David an opportunity to respond, which I'm going to read here now. The Logic has a proud tradition of journalistic independence. Our guidelines are posted publicly on our website for anyone to read. I remain grateful to the news organizations and businesses that stood alongside us as we sought accreditation to cover Collusion. We look forward to reporting on the event and will continue to convene our subscribers as we have always done. Why am I talking about this? Does any of this even matter? As Paddy says on the podcast, many of the controversies he's leaned into, the disparaging statements that he's made, the cordial invitations to speak on his stage, maybe even this podcast, have all been connected to a tendency to seek ways to drive interest and ticket sales for Collusion in the weeks leading up to the event. After our recording, Paddy referred to himself as bold. He even tweeted it, which in Ireland means a uniquely Irish way of misbehaving. And if there is one thing you learned from this podcast, it might be that. Okay, one final programming note. This is the longest intro of all time. This conversation was an hour and 20 minutes. And we cut it down in the interest of time and removing, well, what we thought our audience might not be interested in. That includes Bono and U2 talk, actually. Collusion programming stuff. Paddy's ongoing spat with Ireland's Deputy Prime Minister, which he does reference on the podcast, but he had discussed kind of in more detail. Now, Paddy might once again raise the flag of serious journalism and come at us aggrieved. But Paddy, you said it yourself, man. This is all just a bit of fun, right? Let's dig in. I think where I want to start is with today's news as of recording. Today that you announced Collusion is coming back to Toronto for 2024. I'm wondering, first off, is that on the same terms as you've agreed previously?
Yes.
Okay, so it's
as
like
far as I'm aware,
continued extension of the extension that we talked about the last time you were here.
Yeah.
Does that include financial commitments from the city?
Yeah, it's just the same as the previous 3-year deal struck in 2019.
Okay.
Yeah.
So that's pretty easy to nail. I'm wondering then, like, what's going on with 2025 and after? Because obviously we reported about like an intention to have kind of a renewed, like a 3-year plan. I'm sure for like any event organizer, you want a little bit more certainty than kind of like 1-year renewals. And it's been an interesting couple of years, like post-COVID and stuff.
Yeah, I think, COVID played a big role. Obviously, there's no mayor in Toronto. So there'd effectively been a deal on the table, in the days before, unfortunately, Mayor Tory had to resign. And so that sort of threw, I suppose, a proverbial spanner in the works. And over the last few weeks, speaking of everybody talking about Collusion, I think the impact of it is that we've gone from a small list of cities in North America, the United States and Canada to a much larger list of cities that I was asked earlier this morning. The rumor is that Montreal are very much chomping at the bit to host Collusion, but I can't confirm that.
Well, I haven't heard anything about Montreal, but we can talk about Vancouver because we've noted. I think we reported this morning actually that we were told that Vancouver actually kind of has put some sort of bid or some sort of proposal to you guys. It seemed like it was, from what we were told, promising bid with a little bit of a cash offer. What is it like to have I guess let me first ask you, would you be interested in moving Collusion to another Canadian city if the relationship with Toronto after next year would come to an end? Because I think some of the things we need to talk about here are like the municipal, provincial, and federal reaction to Collusion, which is like some weird Canadiana, but you obviously host a bunch of different events in geographies all around the world. I'm wondering how you see that lens.
And that might be useful. So, we host a much larger event, the kind of antecedent or original conference called Web Summit, which was started over a decade ago in Europe. It was started in Dublin. It outgrew the infrastructure of the city. We moved to Lisbon. At that time, there was a kind of, we were pursued by 3 countries, Great Britain, the Netherlands, and Lisbon. We chose Lisbon. It was, speaking about kind of cash, it was the smaller event fee offer, but for other reasons, we thought that I thought Lisbon was a very up and coming city. Other people, including many in the media, thought it was a ridiculous decision to go to a sort of a tourist destination in November. But Lisbon has moved, I think, from a forgotten child of Europe to the sort of hippest startup city in Europe over the period of 6 or 7 years that we've been there. I thought there was stuff already happening. I don't think Web Summit made Lisbon in that regard, but the reason for the Portuguese government approaching us was to change perceptions around Lisbon and Portugal, which is quite known for tourism, some film, surfing, stuff like that, and they wanted to have heavier associations with tech. It's very complex to run an event at the scale of Web Summit. If you take Collusion as an example, it's by far both the largest and most complex event that Enercare host. Involves the largest number of contractors, union contractors that Enercare deal with. and it's not easy to host an event of the the scale of these conferences. And there's lots of kind of unforeseen complications. I mean, we have people that work full time internally trying to resolve visa issues with entrepreneurs traveling from Uganda, Rwanda, Pakistan, and these are complex and not easy cases for any country, including Canada, to process the volumes of visas from people that are entrepreneurs, basically coming into Canada
or potentially even your staff to help organize, right?
Yeah, we've had issues with staff getting visas to come to Toronto just for the week of Collusion itself. So there are many variables. You need to have an international airport with relatively high levels of connectivity to other major hubs, meaning that it can never be more than 2 flights away from kind of anywhere in the world. New Orleans, for example, it was a major hindrance. The flight connectivity was really terrible. It was one of the many reasons for leaving. There was a lot of attraction to New Orleans. It's got a special kind of vibe, but in the end, I don't think it's the best place to run a large international event. Probably good for running a very US-focused event. Just a nightmare if you're trying to get there from South America. You got to do a number of connecting flights. So yeah, there's many reasons for picking a city, and they just go into a kind of a matrix, and you try to make the best decision.
I guess so. What I'm hearing from you is like you're hosted by a city, but this is more than a municipal event. You need, whether it's federal commitments, that international kind of accessibility. It's got to be a global city for this to work. I'm wondering then, like, would you consider some of our other international cities, whether it's Vancouver or Montreal, to be potential destinations? Like, are you talking with Vancouver right now? I know Mayor Ken Sim's going to be.
If you take Montreal for example, it's impressive. They've experienced hosting F1. They there's sort of they have very deep pockets and pay huge amounts, even for sporting events. I think they pay about 40 million before costs for the Montreal Grand Prix a year. And maybe I think there's probably some downsides, but these are all kind of things. It's the week before the conference. It's not massively top of mind, kind of right now, and it's something that we'll spend the next kind of 9 months going through a process. And we've done this in other parts of the world, and we're working with the Secretary of Commerce from the United States and the Department of State Department in the US, who are very interested in relocating Collusion out of Canada. The US is on a big sort of tech push charm offensive. They've got all sorts of different geostrategic kind of motivations, and maybe there's an American city that we might consider going back to.
Yeah. Okay. So obviously, noting that we're having this conversation a week beforehand, it's a bit obvious you need to be focused on executing for this year. I'm wondering though, like when you take a look at that kind of months down the road, as you noted, will you be re-engaging with some of the cities that were among the 6, with including Toronto, the pitch process for the current situation? Or maybe I won't even go back to, because you had noted.
Well, like, the pitch, the process was always starting in kind of 2025 for Vancouver and other cities that had at this point were involved in the process. There's now some more. The extension with Toronto had been mooted for some time, and we managed late last week to kind of reach an agreement on some of the finer points, basically.
Just for next year, though. So I guess at what
just
point
year,
was it the departure of Mayor Tory that kind of changed it from a 3-year conversation to a 1-year conversation? Because we noted, like, as of December of last year, there were letters being sent by municipalities with Destination Toronto included, talking about a 3-year plan at just over 40 million. I think we should note as well, for listeners and viewers, that
a city without a mayor, a city the size of Toronto, obviously, look, some cities in the world are different. Mayors don't have a lot of political power. Some cities, they have a lot of political power. And in the case of Toronto, it was my experience that the mayor of Toronto is a significant political force. And Mayor Tory, let's remember, was someone who came to Lisbon, met with his peers, the mayor of Lisbon, the government, and some ministers to understand why a country much smaller than Canada had gone out of its way first to bring Web Summit to Portugal and then to keep Web Summit in Portugal. And it was hard for them, I guess, to come up against the German, the French, the Italian, the Spanish, the British governments who really, from their point of view, saw the immense benefit of an international conference.
When we talked in, I think it was 2018, after Collusion had been announced that it was coming, but it was the year before as part of that kind of work, I think you had said at that time, as well as today, Mayor Tory had been one of the kind of the figureheads kind of leading a proposal. And you had noted that went all the way up to Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. And then, hey, from a local tech ecosystem perspective, Sino Strummer. I'm wondering if you feel like you have that diversity of support for Canadian continuation past next year, or like, I guess I'm just wondering, like, was it the transition from Mayor Tory, or there are other conversations? How does this go from like a 3-year conversation to a 1-year conversation? Because even when we talked last year, when you guys had kind of noted that the original 3-year deal had been pushed back for 2 years because obviously COVID had kind of suspended that.
It was a very unusual situation, both by COVID and the unforeseen departure of Mayor Tory at a very kind of critical moment.
Okay, so I guess what I'm hearing here is that, like, you've noting what you need at a municipal all the way up kind of level for an international city to host this. This has been fundamentally a strange time. I want to maybe ask one last question, then we can move forward to the maybe the more interesting bits. Do you think the Collusion will be in Canada past 2024? Like, what's your level of optimism past kind of like next year?
I don't really know. These are all kind of things. I think over the last month, the sort of, I think Canadians, certainly it would seem at a high political office, they think very globally. Canada's part of the G7. The ministers are very globally focused in their outlook. They're thinking about what's good for Canada over the next kind of 10 years. And they're perceptive, I think, of that there's always going to, there's a localism which is strong in Canada. Kind of, I don't know. I think it's unfair to characterize it as a kind of a Canada first type movement.
Let's dig in on this, because I've been thinking about this a lot and writing about it. I see it as almost these separate city states within a national archetype. And I'm wondering how hard that must be, because, when we did our podcast last week, the week before, noting, like when you secured Portugal for Web Summit, that country is the size of like 2 Nova Scotias. The distance between Toronto and Vancouver is, or I guess a flight between Toronto and Vancouver is longer than Toronto to Paris and more expensive. Like, is some of the difficulty here just the massive geography separating most of Canada?
Well, I'm no Canada kind of expert, but I think it's very understandable that at a certain level, in any large country, you'll have people that don't see the divisions within the country and the geography within the country. They see Canada in the world, and that's what they're preoccupied by. Could be their mandate of their job or their political office. And then, of course, at other levels, people are focused. It could be in Ireland between the capital city and the other city. It just depends.
We can never appease Cork enough for them to.
It entirely depends on your, on your perspective. And I think Canada's a massively important global economy, big player on the kind of international stage. Large part of the motivation and interest in Collusion was about Canada in the world and Canadian companies in the world and companies from around the world and investors from around the world coming to Canada. I never heard in any of the sort of discussions that I was engaged in anything about Toronto needs to beat Waterloo, or we need to shine compared to Vancouver or anything like that. That wasn't. I mean, maybe at some level that's what Mayor Tory thought about, but I don't think so. I think he was kind of, obviously he was the mayor of Toronto, and needs to represent their interests. But I do feel he was wearing a kind of a bigger Canadian hat when he was engaged with us.
Yeah, no, I wonder how often that Canadian hat that someone in Toronto might wear is recognized across the country. I think, one of the things, and I say this as someone who's trying to like pay attention to it myself, because, noting this year, I believe like last year, there is going to be a Vancouver takeover of Collusion, and the concept of a takeover, even though there's strong participation across ecosystems, isn't something that you normally label if you feel like Collusion in Toronto is your event too, rather than something you're traveling for. But, to your point in terms of the federal conversation, like the seats that you must be sitting in, the conversations you must be having, our reporting has been at maybe the start of a lot of national conversations about Collusion in the last 2 months, from that initial May story. And I want to go through. So like we had, you've been mentioning Montreal, Phil Telio, who is obviously the founder and CEO of Montreal-based tech festival, Startup Fest, kind of called you guys a Collusion a bad spouse, but I think mostly focused a lot of the vitriol towards Canadian governments, which he said were effectively paying foreign companies to compete against locally grown tech events. But then you have Mayor Tory once again saying it's important for federal and provincial governments to recognize that Collusion is important and step up. I think, again, to your point, wearing a hat beyond his responsibility as a mayor. And then you've got, Mayor Kenston just actually had a community-driven event in Vancouver last week saying that his first primary goal is to make sure that Collusion stays in Canada. And then whatever that takes will be supportive, he said. I'm wondering if you want to maybe could we have a conversation a little bit about the value prop or how you present that to these different levels? Because I know we've indicated or reported on, and you shared in your announcement today, some of that economic impact. Like I think this year you're expecting some 40,000 attendees. I believe it was around 30,000 last year. You're looking at, according to Destination Toronto, which is the organization that kind of helps facilitate this on behalf of the city, 49 million in direct spending as a result of Collusion this year, and 77 million in economic impact for the 3 years that was in person. So 2019, 2022, and then this year, that's 119 million in direct spending, 188 million in economic impact for those 3 years. Everyone in Canada seems to be having a different perspective on what the value of this event is and maybe who it's for more specifically and how they're driving that value. What is your kind of pitch in terms of how cities or countries should be seeing this? And I don't mean sell your conference, but how do you see it?
At the end of the day, my objective is just to build the best international kind of tech conference in North America. That's the objective. If there are second order consequences, that isn't, that's a indirect consequence of bringing people from all over the world, bringing the executive producer of 60 Minutes to go digging on the streets of Toronto late at night to find if there are any major scandals entangling US politicians here or something like that. That's it's not, it's not for me to say what the economic benefit is. That's for a city to assess, and they have their own statisticians. And
no, sorry, I'm not saying you should take ownership of them, but you are sharing them along with the announcement. There's got to be either some pride or conviction behind those numbers, or you wouldn't be sharing them. If it's not the economic component, how do you, when you're talking to these other cities, when you're kind of sourcing attention, even going back all the way whether it's through Web Summit starts or Collusion's origins in Vegas through New Orleans, I guess at what level do you kind of pitch a vision or the value or that, or do you just kind of say, I'm going to put on a thing, and if people show up, they show up, and if they enjoy it, they'll come back next year?
Yeah, that's we just focus on, building a successful, globally focused tech conference. And, there tend to be second order consequences for the locations where those events happen to be located. They're measurable using reasonable statistical approaches. I'm sure there's some differences between maybe how Portugal calculates it and how Toronto calculated. I know, for example, that there are, because within Toronto they can't access some data that at a federal level they're allowed to handle. This has to do with ATM withdrawals and credit card
and privacy information.
And credit card transactions. Whereas in Portugal, they're able to isolate activity by country, and they can see the week after and the week before Web Summit, and then they can get a very kind of precise estimate of the uplift in activity. Because you have to remember as well that for Web Summit in particular, there are a lot more people who come to Lisbon for Web Summit that don't actually attend the event. If you look at Collusion, there are literally hundreds of side events, and there would be a lot of people who've come to Toronto who are like, yeah, you know what, I'm not going to spend.
This was the prompt, and this is what we were told, is that
bucks.
I don't think people, from the people that we spoke to in and around the process of getting Collusion to Canada and Toronto, one of the sticking points for them was really this idea that these are international attendees, and the revenue generated is from outside of the country and certainly from outside of the city, as opposed to like TIFF or some other events that might draw large attendance from across the province.
But also these things aren't, I don't think they're binary. I think it's useful to note that you take Portugal, for example. It wasn't a location for international conferences really before Web Summit went there. Now there are tons of international tech conferences throughout the year, and there are lots of local tech conferences that have bubbled up, and in part because lots of people got exposure to how you might run a tech conference. People have worked at Web Summit as contractors, have understood how you might, run a better kind of local event. And so, there are just so many, both local and international tech conferences in Portugal, largely as a consequence of Web Summit going there. And the fact that Web Summit is there doesn't mean that other people can't have a conference during the year. Not just in Lisbon, never mind in another city. It's not like, I'm wearing a watch, and once I have one watch on my wrist, it's kind of one of these things that,
returns.
Whereas conferences, I think, are awfully like restaurants in that you can go to a restaurant on a Monday, it can be a burger joint, and on Tuesday you can just go to a Thai restaurant. And conferences are kind of the same, and I think it's why a lot of people that organize conferences, there's a great collegiality around it. People go to each other's events. They love going to other people's kind of conferences, and they're not mutually exclusive products. And
I agree with that, and we work with a variety of events across Canada because we feel that way. We feel like we have a national mandate when we're covering tech, but like that has obviously not been the case so far with Collusion, and I'm wondering why you think that is.
What do you mean by that?
Well, you had the head of another event take out an op-ed basically saying you should leave, and we've had
he was just looking for a bit of publicity for his event. I'd never heard of Startup Fest before somebody drew my attention.
You should really go. It's a great
to this article, and I'm sure it's great. And I was like, oh God, who is this guy? And so I just checked. I was like, oh, he's been to tons of our events, and he's brought a multitude of staff to a multitude of our events in multiple locations.
Are you surprised
around the world?
Are you surprised by the response then? Like, is this unique to Canada? Because I'm trying to understand it too. Like I think that
the response is kind of great because there's a huge amplification of the fact that Collusion is occurring. That ends up just selling tons of tickets. It's like, to a degree, running a conference is a little like promoting. It's not like you're not promoting a fight per se, but you're promoting this event that is going to occur. And almost any controversy, especially for business people are pragmatic. They're not necessarily ideological. They're not like, I don't know, maybe I agree with that guy, maybe I don't agree with that guy, maybe he's making some good points, maybe he's not. But at the end of the day, I have some targets I have to hit, and I think there will be some people in town, so I'm going to head along to that thing that I had forgotten about. And that's sort of,
So were you saying that the conversations around Collusion for the last 2 months are ones that you think have been a net positive for the conference, or some have been? Because you stepped in it a little bit in certain instances, right?
None of the
whether with us or with others.
Let me give you some background. So I'm by far the largest funder of investigative journalism in Ireland. I've been involved in almost all of the most, I would say, substantive journalism that has taken place in Ireland in recent years. From triggering the first criminal investigations into senior politicians in the history of the state. The former Prime Minister of Ireland was, placed under criminal investigation in 2020 as a consequence of a whistleblower that I encouraged to come forward. brought him together with a great journalist, and the rest is sort of history. Even within the last 12 months, two former Web Summit employees, I fund their Web Summit funds their endeavor. We've committed €1 million to their work over the next 5 years. Triggered the resignation of multiple ministers. I've been, interviewed by police for my work on some of these stories. I've been threatened. My wife has been threatened. People have, broken into our property with knives and threatened my wife over the stuff that I'm involved in. I have a little bit of an idea of a certain type of journalism. So it's hard, investigative journalism, focusing on those in positions of power who may be involved in wrongdoing.
Yeah, and I think that's fully noted. I'm just wondering then, given
so
that...
when you were given the number 40 million, I wondered, where did that come from? My presumption was it's called kite flying. And it...
no, I can actually share, because the number, we reported initially that the number was over 42 million, because at that point in the time, we were, as journalists, as responsible journalists, we take the protection of our sources very seriously. As you know, as a supporter of journalism, that's almost the first rule.
Well, why would somebody want to share this with you?
Well, I think there's a lot of potential answers for that, but I would note that over 40 million number is...
There's no wrongdoing involved here. So why would a politician or a city official want to share this with you?
I wouldn't know why a politician or a city official might want to share it with us. But I will say that I think the reason why we reported on that information is that we think that our audience, and I would say, and this is interesting for us because we're a Canadian tech publication. We are, in certain instances, a trade publication for innovation, but sometimes these conversations touch upon a broader social kind of lens, and I think this certainly did, because in this instance, the person of power here is you, Paddy, and this is Collusion is an organization that has received, and I want to note here, I tried to do it before, that when we're talking about these dollar figures, a lot of it is in-kind offsets for facilities, Wi-Fi, things like this. This isn't a pure cash disbursement where a Brinks truck for Collusion backs up, but we felt like, and the response was, I think, the dramatic response to the conversations that we've seen in the last 2 months, I think had been because people did not know, they did not have access to information in this country, that Destination Toronto was putting together a proposal asking for $4 million from the government of Ontario, $4 million from the government of Canada, and then $6.2 million from the city of Toronto for $14.2 million annually, adding up to $42.6 million over 3 years for 2024, 2025, and 2026. Now, when they were pushing that proposal, and I've seen the documents, and I think at this point we're happy to note that we have more documents than we disclosed initially.
And you've seen emails from my staff asking for this.
Asking for?
This amount of money that you allege we've asked for.
I don't know what you're referring to. I think
42 million.
Oh, well, I can tell you it's from the documents that we obtained that were put together as part of a proposal for the renewed 3-year agreement. I can show them to you now, right?
So this is the proposal that Toronto were willing to put together. This isn't a request from us.
Yes, Paddy, but when you interview for a job, the contract is sent by the company, but there's obviously a negotiation about salary, vacation, holiday, right? So This is obviously a conversation here, right?
So I'll tell you what happened, because this is a world I work in, and
I want to know. I truly
facilitate hard investigative journalism. There's no wrongdoing in this case whatsoever, so it's very different. In this instance, I recognized it because this is not a number at all that we asked for. That's not even how the process runs. That this was what's called kite flying. I don't know if you have kite flying in Canada, but what a public official or a politician will do in order to create the sort of oxygen to make a decision that they need to make, they will fly a kite. The kite oftentimes will have a number attached to it that will be larger than the number they're actually working towards. It could be far larger. And so this number, I felt, was fed to you. You bid on it. And I thought what I would do is just, I didn't even have to respond to any of the emails you reached out to me. I would just feed you some bait as well.
Well, you did respond, Paddy.
and
We'll
you
get to that in a minute. But let's talk about this proposal, because this is,
And
I'll be clear here. This is coming from the organization
Sure.
that is responsible for facilitating Collusion being in Toronto. It doesn't go fulsomely through the city. It goes through Destination Toronto, which is a not-for-profit tourism investment advocacy organization, right? So, and again, very clear, this is kind of net new reporting. I think it aligns to our initial May story. I think what we're saying here is, while we frame the number in that as an equivalent to Web Summit being in Lisbon.
But your reporting implies that we asked for this.
Well, you submitted a request for bids, Paddy. Like, your comms team confirmed it with us. Toronto is one of the 6 cities.
No, but
Are you telling me that you would have turned down $42.6 million over 3 years in support?
Any government or city, they're free to offer
too much.
us,
We asked, you guys gave us too much. We're not asking for that much.
But they're free to offer us 10 billion if they so wish. But that's then a story about the government. It's not a story about us as the organizer.
Oh, well, I think it's correlated. But to your point, though, I think part of the almost the live wire that has been touched upon some of these conversations is the idea that they're, the Globe and Mail just released a new initiative, I think last week, all around like freedom of information requests, because it's a huge issue in this country. We don't actually, as citizens, have access to like the information that we should have in terms of a functioning democracy. Like, we don't actually know what's going on behind the scenes. And that from a federal down to the municipal level creates a great frustration amongst Canadians for a variety of reasons, provinces. Like, we could do a whole other podcast.
I learned from a reporter from the Globe and Mail just about an hour ago that it's possibly amongst the most regressive freedom of information regimes in the Western world, which is quite stunning, considering Canada is so progressive in other areas. It's a clear anomaly that has to be fixed.
So I think part of the reaction to this has been people. I would say there's 2 groups of people, or maybe 3. There's 3. There is the group of people that come to BetaKit every day for Canadian tech news, startup news, who wants to know if Collusion's coming back or not. What's the situation? Oh crap, the mayor's gone. Is that going to impact that? Are we going to Collusion next year? Are we going to be on the party yacht? There is the broad, let's say, Toronto, Ontarian Canadian populace who is coming to this as a political story, wondering at this point in time whether at the provincial or federal or municipal level, like Toronto's in a budget crisis, there's only so much spending to go around, and they should have access to information of like what our government's priorities are. And then there's that third small group of event organizers across Canada who don't receive the level of subsidies that you have been able to negotiate, if not ask for, and are upset about that. And I think part of our job, the reason why this story took so long, is that we started looking to tell a pure tech story, and it became a much bigger story because of what's required to bring an event of Collusion size to this country, right? So, I'm not going to get into the motivations of why people share information with journalists. I think our motivation for including this information is we thought our audience had a right to know, and it kind of set this process in context, particularly since this is a process where this didn't turn out, right? As we've discussed, the current situation is a 1-year agreement. My friends, let's cut to the chase. You're a founder, an entrepreneur, you're hungry, you're fast, you're agile, and you need a legal eagle that matches your pace. The answer? This episode's sponsor, Good Lawyer. Now, this isn't your grandpa's law firm. Good Lawyer is the trusted legal partner of thousands of businesses nationwide, boasting fixed-fee legal projects and their revolutionary fractional general counsel. And look, I'm no lawyer. I can't tell you what tort law means, only that it sounds delicious. But when BetaKit found itself in a labyrinth of legalities, Good Lawyer stepped in, delivering results that were as efficient as they were cost-effective. Plus, Good Lawyer's fractional general counsel isn't just versed in the law, they become versed in your business. They stand in the trenches with you, offering practical legal advice that fuels your momentum. So visit goodlawyer.ca today to see for yourself and tell them that BetaKit sent you. But I have to note that some of the conversation around this has been particularly you said, I think a minute ago, that you didn't have issues with our journalism, or you could have responded. Like, you did respond. And you said some things to my reporter, and I'm wondering, like, given that you are a staunch supporter of journalism, why you would treat my reporter that way, for just kind of doing his job and asking you questions.
Oh, to get him to bite down on the story, because I knew I'm not dealing with a salty investigative journalism. I'm dealing with a buzzy business reporter, and I'll just feed him a little bit of bait, and then he will get really excited about the story, and he'll feel that there's lots here, and then he and you will exert a lot of effort into it, and you will help amplify a story around a number that is spurious. But is ultimately being used.
So are you saying you have never seen any document?
Nope.
Destination Toronto never communicated to you, and we're like very much on the record here.
Yeah. No.
The proposal that they were passing around, that was included with a letter signed by that organization, a variety of other municipalities, dated December 2022.
No, never saw it.
Okay, well we're on the record there. I want to go back though to you first, just noting off the fact, and this is really touching me. I don't think anyone has ever referred to Josh as a Buzzy reporter, so I think he'll wear that badge with pride. But this wasn't just like you pushing back on, I think, some inexperienced journalists that might need to do a second pass. Like you called us dishonest.
Not inexperienced.
You called us scumbags.
Yep.
You called us creeps, and you implied that we were the type of publication that took money for stories. And I really didn't I guess I didn't really want to have the conversation this way. I think, when you think about having this conversation, because this is the third time that we've podcasted, we've had several like genial conversations before. I'm not here to litigate the back and forth. And fundamentally, I think it's important for the public to kind of know what journalists have to deal with day by day to just reach the burden of putting something out in the world for publication. I'm just wondering how you can reconcile the statements that you've made about support for journalism with this private commentary, and then we could talk about the situation with the logic, but like this has all resulted in like a cordial invitation for BetaKit and others to be on stage at Collusion. And I'm just wondering, if you thought we were scumbags, if you thought we were creeps, like why you would be here. I just want to know if you thought that was a responsible way to engage with my reporter, when at that time we were just trying to confirm what ultimately happened, that this Collusion was coming back to Toronto on a one-year bridge.
Please do publish the correspondence, with Web Summit, because then that will establish if, Web Summit actually requested of Toronto the offer that you talk about, and that would certainly put it all to bed.
I just want to be clear here, because I want to make sure like I understand it. So your understanding of this, what you're trying to convey, is the idea is that there are organizations that you have directly worked with, both right now in announcing a renewed deal and in the initial deal, that would be floating proposals at all levels of government, coinciding with letters of support, urging that this dollar figure, which matches what Portugal committed to keep Web Summit for, I believe, another 10 years, and that you or your team would not be aware of that at all. Do you want to make a direct statement to Destination Toronto and the city, like just equivocally saying, guys, don't worry about it, we never needed to be?
It's all new. It's all information. It's all news to me.
All right. So then let's go back to the commentary then. Like, what's going on here?
Don't know. It goes back to what I've just said. I decided that it was helpful, obviously, for almost all parties involved, just to have a bit of a public kerfuffle around this stuff. And so I did exactly what I knew would work. I work with lots of great journalists, and I'm sure you guys are great journalists as well. And I sort of know the hot buttons, and I just pressed a few hot buttons. And I can't tell you what to write, so I just decided, oh well, I'll feed some meat here that you can't as a journalist. You're like, how dare you? And then you just bite down on it.
Our initial reaction was actually like, what's going on here? Why is he saying these things? This doesn't make sense. But I'd also have to note, like, it's Paddy, I gotta give you credit. It's a bold strategy. I was going to ask if you thought that like that was the way that you should be handling engagement as a journalist. I ultimately don't care because we're going to do our job anyways. But I think it's worthwhile noting that section that we included in the story, because we felt obligated to understand these types of conversations, would not have run in that story.
But I was very clear it was on the record. I told you, please take my comments. They're absolutely on the record.
Oh yeah, you stood by them, 100%.
Yeah.
I just have a hard time reconciling that with maybe the conversation that we're had today or statements that you've made online since then. And I have to think it's a little bit related to the conversations going on around this. But I want to get off this topic. I don't think we have anything maybe more interesting to say about that. I'm wondering though, I want to ask you if you how you felt like this run of time in Toronto has gone. I think we can go back and we talked about the COVID stuff, and obviously that putting a dent in this. When we talked last year, the plan was to kind of re-up for a longer commitment. I wonder if you feel like Toronto or Canada has been a good partner for Collusion, or if some of the things that we've been discussing here have created different.
I think it's been great. I think there's a tendency in Canada for Canadians to beat themselves up a little bit, to think 100%. That, Canadians are so apologetic. Oh, geez, just apologize for everything. Always worried that you're not having a good time. It's a weird kind of default position. I don't know why. Maybe it's the lack of sunlight.
No, I think it's I completely agree with you, and I think it's a proximity to the United States.
Okay.
It's a
reaction almost.
40 million people across a geography that's huge in relationship to the cultural, political, economic monolith that we all live an hour away from. I think it directly relates to that. And I think, one of the things that I wanted to ask you about, if we're going to have an honest conversation here, is I think that it's, I have noticed a trend, and I think it even happened. There was an event that you were at Mars right after the announcement of Collusion, where it was kind of a kickoff event, try to garner interest, get the community organized. That there was a significant change from, say, 2018, when Toronto and Canada generally was really looking to get on the national stage for tech and garner and get that attention, and maybe the stamp of certificate of authenticity when it comes to that stuff. And the perception of the value of Collusion shortly after it was announced that it was coming. And I remember being at that event with the initial excitement that this is happening. And then you were, I think, on stage with Sunil having a conversation what it was going to look like. And it didn't seem like the room was very interested in hearing what you had to say. And then in following years, I've noted that there's been this weird, oh yes, look, Collusion's come to Toronto, huge stamp of whatever, but I'm not going to go because I don't see a lot of value. And it seemed to have progressed now. And for whatever reason, I think we've laid out a couple here. You seem to be on the side that it doesn't impact as much and actually can be a benefit for raising exposure. That there's just the number of people, and I mean this sincerely, the number of people that come to me is I can't wait till this event is gone, has been surprising to me, because I don't understand it. And I think it speaks to that weird relationships that Canadians have with global activities that might be here, that they don't feel like they get to participate in as well as they should, but maybe aren't that happy that it happens here. And I'm wondering, if you notice that, and if it makes your job any more difficult to have contingent of people in the local ecosystem not looking to engage or kind of looking past that. That must be an issue, right? Or how do you respond to that stuff?
Yeah, it doesn't really seem to matter in terms of the numbers. I mean, it's such a global gathering. I mean, of course, people may feel that way, and in Toronto, I mean, the cost of benefiting from the event is next to zero. If you don't want to get a ticket, I mean, that's totally fine. You can still meet a lot of people that are in the city. But if there are other people repeatedly traveling from New Zealand or Brazil or effectively the other side of the world, the Middle East, all over Africa, to be here, and tens of thousands of them, I don't know. There's some value for them, and the folks in Toronto don't feel there's any value. They don't have to pay for a hotel. They don't need to pay for a flight. All the other associated expenses. Okay, that's great. I mean, everything must be just fantastic and going so well that they don't need to meet any VCs from Benchmark or Andreessen Horowitz or anyone else, or leading journalists from around the world, or potential customers. That's good in some ways. It's a reflection maybe of the vibrancy of tech in Toronto. I don't know.
I do think that Canadians have an interesting relationship with their governments at all levels right now that fuels a conversation like this, because your organization is required to participate with governments, and there's collateral damage maybe, or you get wrapped into conversations of whether or not we're supporting hospitals and things like that. But
I mean, the thing that we've learned, and look, unfortunately, there's a long history over the last decade that I tend to lean into controversies around any event that we're holding anywhere in the world, especially 4 weeks out, because the volume of tickets that are booked locally is highest in the final weeks, because you can wait right up until the last moment.
That's the classic move. You got to do it, right?
I mean, it's
why I don't do events, Paddy. Like I'm not interested in that kind of stress that you have to deal with.
And I don't do media because, and this is an important point. I was talking to the Globe and Mail about this, because I think there's a much bigger story that maybe is being missed around the role of media and what happens when a media entity starts organizing an event. An editor morphs into something that's a little bit more than just a kind of journalist. And I separate as best I can my interest, or Web Summit's interest, in really good journalism and what Web Summit does. Because if you're both an event organizer and a journalist, it's very difficult to stop your interest in pumping your event or pushing your event bleeding into your editorial sort of independence and integrity. So we've never engaged in publishing or media ourselves. We organize an event, and then it's a free-for-all for journalists to attend, because were we to start publishing stories, I think a lot of journalists would feel, yeah, we can go, but all the good scoops.
I'm not so sure if an event company publishing media is journalism or marketing, but I will note that I can listen to some podcasts and read some posts on the Collusion blog. I was checking that out earlier today. But it's interesting. You have some very refined perspectives on the value and proper way of doing journalism. I'm not really interested in having that conversation, because again, we stand outside of it. We're just trying to do our work here. I will note, maybe given that, you and your organization made some changes to your policy as it relates to supporting other events, and I'm just wondering, given how strongly you feel about this stuff, why you might have made that change.
The change, I was just thinking of something. The change
in relation to accessibility for the logic to attend.
The amazing thing in all of this for me. And I can't comment ultimately on David Skok, but I publicly called David Skok a liar, and he has sidestepped the issue entirely. And I think, as a journalist, if somebody is to say publicly that you are a liar, a serial liar, that if you don't address that as a journalist, that cuts to the very core of your entire integrity as a journalist. And I think
so. This is really interesting, because there's I will say potentially here, I'm just suggesting, and I'm not going to speak on behalf of David or the Logic, because the BetaKit stuff is our reporting, and the Logic stuff is to do with accreditation and other events.
It is good reporting, and it is well written, by the way.
Josh is a very good writer. I think what we're touching upon here is a little bit of maybe I'm suggesting a cultural difference in terms of approach to media in different countries. And as someone who's lived in the United States and experienced that, there's most Canadians would be familiar with an obvious difference between U.S. and Canadian media and approach. And I'm sure from where you're coming from, there's a different approach there. But to that point of, if a real journalist would respond if someone calls them a liar, I think that you should spend more time talking to journalists, because I think most journalists these days deal with that every single day for every single story, and are potentially inured to comments that aren't dealing with respect to reality. Now, I have no insight into
I speak to some of the best journalists literally in the world every day, and I think that in the case of the Logic,
how many of them do you call liars? How just as like a test, we should run an experiment and get a couple people and call them liars and see how they respond.
Just David Scott. So, I think it was, he's organizing his own event. He didn't realize that we had copies of emails he was sending to people, and where he's explaining that he's piggybacking on the back of Collusion.
Let's connect that with what you had said before, though, because you were talking about the collegiality that often happens between events. Isn't this an opportunity here to engage with a local event that'd be taking place literally before Collusion officially starts, because there's no opening event Monday evening, right? So it's taking place before things kick off on Tuesday.
There's dozens of events on the opening night.
Oh, yeah, fair. But we're talking about
involved and help promote upwards of 100 local events.
Isn't there an opportunity here? Could you maybe not understand how certain media entities would not appreciate that treatment? That you're
David Scott is a conference organizer who's disparaging our event to our speakers, saying that his audience was far more. I don't know what it was better. And this event was adjacent, but with a more something audience. And, there's, look, none of these things are kind of black and white, but
yeah, I think there's some in speaking to your team about it, and speaking to a variety of media outlets across North America that responded when
crying freedom of the press when we did not rescind his 3 journalists, and it's in writing. I haven't released the email. It's just so ludicrous. It's unbelievable. You just say he's restricting my freedom to profit off my own event, and that's fine.
So then,
don't conflate it with a press freedom issue. That's just sort of a real misuse of, I think, something that's very integral to our societies. Like it's a really important right. And
I'm wondering then, given your firm conviction in this and your sophisticated concepts of journalism, why then the cordial invitation? Why the about face? Do you feel like you're
there's no about face on the issuing of press credentials, and he still hasn't addressed that. I mean, it's in writing. So I
believe he submitted an update to his subscribers following the tweets that you posted.
Oh yeah, and he still didn't address it, but whatever, it's fine. I just thought it was a bit of fun. It's like, come on up on stage and back to my view. So I've got the Deputy Prime Minister getting up in Parliament, abusing parliamentary privilege, accusing me of being involved in a Russian conspiracy to destabilize his government because 2 former Web Summit employees who Web Summit funds have exposed corruption so serious that it's led to multiple resignations of government ministers. And, I see this stuff is, it's not a storm in a teacup, but it's kind of it's kind of good drama. Hopefully makes for good listening, a bit of good reading, a bit of fun journalism, because so much of tech journalism, is just sort of a little riff on sort of a press release about new users and new funding rounds, stuff like that. So it's to me, it's a bit of theater.
Okay.
So I don't mind kind of leaning in on it. I do think David Scott, though, is, and I'm sure he's a great journalist, and I'm sure he's a great human being and a very serious person. But I think probably as a journalist, it's tough. He's running his own business. He's getting into events, and I do think that is difficult to reconcile the dilemmas that sometimes can kind of emerge, and that's fine. You just need to maybe be a bit more upfront in declaring them. And you look at the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal. They organize events. We've organized events with the Wall Street Journal, and they are much larger than the Logic, obviously.
What about the Globe and Mail? That's an organization that continuously runs events. What about the Canadian Press? What about TechCrunch?
Yep.
I think there's been a variety of organizations that I think, and not to specifically address anyone, but who probably would side, let's just say, put it in the middle. They would side strongly with the idea of freedom of the press. I think some of that might just be due to the fact that in the run up to the conference, you might have received an indication that there were other publications that were less interested in participating in Collusion, contingent upon the always been the case or in development accreditation of certain Canadian journalists. And
the Globe and Mail's business editor sent us a sort of, off the hip sort of reaction that, he had to show a support for his peer whose freedom to report had been attacked by us. And then when we just presented the facts, I mean, the journalists are living in, times where I'm sure if you're in the Globe and Mail or any other publication, time is a precious kind of commodity. And he took David Scott on his word. And so all the Globe and Mail journalists pulled out of Collusion. And then 60 minutes later, didn't.
Shortly following your tweet?
No, I just presented a little bit of clarification.
I guess,
and he to be very fair, great journalist in the Globe and Mail. He's not kind of picking sides here. My view is he's like, it's not black, it's not white. It's just a bit messy. Oh, I don't want to get involved in this.
Yeah, I think we're getting a bit in the weeds here. We're long past them, but I'm wondering when it comes to Collusion, maybe this year. I'm wondering if you are as excited for Collusion this year to be hosted in Toronto as you were in 2018 going into 2019, and if how that measures with potential excitement for a continued relationship in 2025. Do you feel like you've built that institutional trust, conviction for Collusion during its Toronto run, given the COVID gap? And we talked about this last year. I want to kind of ask you again. Do you feel like you've built that trust here over this weird 3-year, 5-year window?
Well, I think the Irish and the Canadians are somewhat similar. There's like a tall poppy syndrome issue. There's kind of sometimes a lot of like negativity. But when we moved when the event was in Dublin, people from Ireland went. It was kind of a little bit kind of taken for granted and like, it's a bit overhyped. And then we moved it to Lisbon. More people from Ireland now go to the event in Portugal than ever went to it when it was in...
This is what I was trying to speak to before. I think there are people that are not going to come to Collusion this year, but went to Web Summit Rio. I don't fully understand that, but it's important. Like, it's our job to note it, and I need to keep thinking about it to do my job better. But where does that lead you in terms of feeling like you've delivered, or honestly, do you feel like you just can't be bothered?
I think of
many of your answers so far.
Conor McGregor, who I don't know what type of figure he is at this point. He had this quote where he said that winners focus on winning and losers focus on winners. And I don't know where I'm going with this, but I don't know. We just we're entirely focused internally and just running the best event that we can. And it's like, okay, if you don't want to come, that's fine. Like nobody's forcing you. It's totally fine. Like just go for drinks with your buddies that are flying in from around the world. There's no big deal. And in some ways, your milieu are, they're very successful, very connected folks in tech. And there's a good argument that, a lot of what Web Summit serves, there's two components to it. There are people that are kind of starting out on their journey in startup land. And, all the locals in the know, not just from Toronto, but the surrounding kind of cities just kind of show up. And people get a lot of their networking done in the evenings and in the mornings and kind of boozy lunches during the event.
Hotel X.
There's nothing wrong with that. And that's the experience in Lisbon, by the way. There's probably 30% more, again, people in the city who just decide, the event is so big, there's so many people from around the world, I'm just going to book I'm going to book a room in one of the hotels where most people are kind of hanging out. There's these hacks for kind of conferences in general. Like if you can figure out where the speaker hotel, it's mostly Hotel X, but maybe you're more interested in meeting investors, so there's a lot of them spread across one or two other hotels. So just go there for breakfast, and there's so much serendipity involved sometimes in life, and you can manufacture it without actually needing to buy a ticket. And
I'm not leaving this podcast booth
plus I'm generally like kind of a little bit insufferable and sort of, I don't know what the word is, like just a bit like dogged on certain things.
I think that's clear. I don't think anyone listening to this episode would contend with that.
Yeah, and I'm a massive supporter of journalism. Obviously, I'm
No, Paddy, don't go back. We talked about that stuff.
Yeah.
We're gonna wrap it up.
I just like getting spicy with some journalists.
Paddy Cosgrave said, "Go to Collusion or don't go."
No, don't go.
Meet people. Don't go. Okay,
No,
just
don't
firmly.
go.
Just
if
firmly
you're
don't go.
Canadian, just go like, fuck off.
Okay.
I'm not going to that thing. God damn it, those people and stuff. Like, can't wait till they're out of our city because insert some reason, and then just because is enough, and then like, oh, I heard they're going to Vancouver. That might be really nice in June, and then come to Vancouver or Montreal
or maybe Mexico City.
Yeah, Mexico City. They've got traffic problems.